Does anybody give me a motion to approve?
So move.
Second.
Perfect. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. On to our second order of business, the approval of the minutes. And these are the minutes from May 21st.
So move.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, and moving on to citizens' comments, and I don't see any tonight. So I think we're moving on to the presentation, the Vulnerability Population Assessment and Climate Adaptation Framework Report, and I have Ted Redmond as the presenter.
Very much, Madam Chair and members of the commission. So I'm Ted Redmond. First of all, I can say that I appreciate very much the work that you guys do. I'm also an environmental commission for the city of Maplewood, so I'm skipping that meeting to be here with you guys. Just a slight background of myself. I'm an architect and function entirely on climate action these days. We do greenhouse gas inventories, community sustainability planning, climate action planning, climate vulnerability and risk assessments, and climate adaptation planning. And so I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the population vulnerability assessment. And one overview comment is climate risk comes in two forms. One form is infrastructural, so roads and bridges and buildings that might be inundated by storms, etc. The other is related to our populations and the impacts that we may want to anticipate in terms of their health and so forth. This study is focused entirely on populations. So I'm certainly happy to receive comments in any form, but just so you understand, the report's been focused on population, not infrastructure. So with that, so this is the review of the contents. It's a 120-page report, and I'm going to go through every single word tonight. No, I'm going to try really hard not to, but I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of what's in there. And I'll try to kind of pop through a little bit faster. So first, introduction, why study climate change vulnerability? Increases in the global surface temperature and changes to precipitation levels and patterns are expected to continue and intensify for decades, regardless of mitigation strategies. So even if we globally meet the Paris Accord, we've got some increases baked into the system. So weather and climate shape our economy. And in the last 10 years alone, extreme weather events have cost Minnesota and the Midwest $96 billion in damage and have resulted in 440 deaths. So that's a good basis for studying it. And we should anticipate that these impacts will continue into the future. So this study is provided through a grant by the MPCA. It seeks to increase awareness, increase inclusion of climate adaptation dialogue within the city decision-making process, to strengthen adaptive capacity, to outline priority risks, vulnerabilities, and possible near-term actions, and to lay the foundation for the development of implementation plans by the city. So that was the purpose of this. Any questions on that sort of quick background of what we're doing and why? Okay. Climate change in the Midwest. The Midwest region is expected to experience a climate that is hotter. It's also going to have more rain overall, but it's also going to have more drought. The reason for that is our rain events are stretching apart. We're having more days between rainfall, which means that we have heavier rain when we have it, and we have more time frame between it, which means it gets drier. Climate change in Minnesota as a state. We can expect an increase in temperature, have already experienced it. We can anticipate a decrease in spring snow cover and a change in USDA hardiness. In fact, we've already, in the last 25 years, have gone from our region here, used to be a pretty solid 4, and now we're about a 5 in most areas in the Twin City. So the hardiness zone's moving north. Of course, our trees don't move north, but the zone is moving north. And that creates a stress, well, I'm sorry, that's in the future there. We can anticipate an increase in rainfall, and we have already experienced it. These charts indicate the precipitation levels over the last 100 years. and we are seeing wetter annual precipitation. And we're seeing an increase in mega rains, which are a rain event which delivers 6 inches of rain over 1,000 square miles, delivering about 14 billion gallons of water. And this graphic illustrates what 14 billion gallons of water looks like falling on Minneapolis. So we can anticipate that that kind of rainfall event stresses our infrastructure and also is a significant risk to flash flooding, which is perhaps even the most biggest concern in terms of flood. So local climate change here in Burnsville, we can anticipate temperatures going up. This chart, the gray section, shows the weather variation as it's occurred since 1950 through about 2010. And then to the right, the colored section, the red zone, shows projections based on business as usual, meaning that we do not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The red line shows kind of the average of what could be expected. And then that sort of pinkish cone is the range of potential, of likely temperatures year by year. So any given year, it's going to vary, right? The blue is what happens if we do meet the Paris Accord reduction goals. So it would still go up, but start to taper off. This section shows days above 95. The reason why we target 95 is a temperature at which typically, depending on what's going on, the human body stops cooling itself. And it's also a temperature at which vulnerable populations start having significant challenge with health issues. Certainly it can happen before that, but at 95 it's a threat. And so for Burnsville, we're going from an average of about 1 or 2 days a year. By the end of the century, we'd be looking at 45 to 55 days on average a year. Cooling degree days is the amount of energy that it takes to cool our spaces. And we're seeing an increase, I don't know if this shows up, yeah. So we're seeing an increase of some 300% in cooling degree days, which translates into a citywide electricity consumption to cool our spaces for the city of Burnsville of about 74%. So in other words, if there are no further technology advances in air conditioning, by the end of this century, we're going to consume 74% more electricity just to keep our buildings cooled as we do right now, if that makes sense. So looking back from over the last 50, 60 years, in our region here, we've experienced an increase in annual temperature of 1.4 degrees. We've experienced an increase in precipitation of about 11% and about 58% increase in heavy precipitation. We've seen an increase in days above 95 of about 1. And we've seen a decrease in days below 32 of about 12, and an increase in the growing season of about 16. So looking forward, those charts that I just showed you represent an increase in the annual temperature of up to 9 to 10 degrees, an increase in annual precipitation. So this is where there's some variation. Some models, the various models that are out there are all very consistent for temperature. On precipitation, there is some variation because there's some uncertainty related to things like the jet stream and how it affects us. So some models show a decrease in up to 14% in precipitation. Other models are showing an increase of up to 11%. What we do know, all models are clear, variability is going to increase with precipitation. A continued increase in heavy precipitation, as I say, an increase in days above 95 of up to 56, a decrease in days below 32 of negative 50, so 50 fewer days below 32, and an increase in the cooling degree days of 293%. So I talk about this as city on the move, because to me I'm visual, and so by the middle of this century, those numbers I just gave you are by the end of this century. By the middle of this century, say about 2040 through 2060-ish or so, the conditions in Burnsville are going to be similar to the conditions felt 450 miles to the south of here. That's the same as moving the city 15 miles south every year, or 217 feet every day. So these blue sections here are the zones that currently have summer weather similar to what Burnsville can expect in that middle of this century time frame. So we're talking about Cape Girardeau, Missouri, Evansville, Indiana, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Dover, Delaware, and of course all the rest of those blue sections there. So any questions on that information or climate projections? Okay. So climate risks to the population. Those climate change projections, as well as others, represent risks to our population in a few ways. Extreme weather and temperature, that's relatively evident when it's hot, or when we have extreme weather, we have health issues. Flood vulnerability, air quality impacts. Right now we have a great example of the forest fires that are sweeping in, and we're actually experiencing air quality impacts. Little known is also there's a direct linkage between increased air temperature and increased air pollution considerations. An increase in vector-borne diseases. Food insecurity and foodborne diseases are possible risks related to climate change. Water quality and quantity projections, and waterborne illness. So these are all impacts that can affect us here in the United States, here in Burnsville. We're not talking India or Africa, here in the backyard. Climate impact multipliers. So I put this in because there are things that, characteristics of a city, which can either mitigate or exacerbate these climate change impacts that I just talked about. And the reason I like to point them out is it also points to some things that we can do as a community to anticipate and to mitigate. So one of the multipliers is tree canopy. Trees are amazing, the services that they provide for us, cooling and air pollution control, etc., energy consumption. So just looking at tree canopy, comparing Burnsville against the Twin City Metro, Burnsville's doing pretty well. You're above the Twin City Metro average. You also have, so the first column is the existing tree canopy. The second column is the total potential canopy. And that's like if you stuff a tree in every spot you could stuff a tree. I love trees. I wouldn't recommend that necessarily, but it just gives us a sense as to the potential, right? So the potential of 64% comparing against the city metro of 47% indicates that even though you're ahead, there might be opportunities for you to even find even more benefit. Impervious land cover, so things like pavement and rooftops. It's important for a number of reasons, stormwater as well as heat island impacts. So the total impervious area statewide is 1.88%. Metro area is 13.7 on average, and Burnsville is 22%. So you're a little higher than metro average, which is always a little shocking for a suburban region. But the metro area is defined as the multi-county region. So if we compare you against Minneapolis, Minneapolis is going to be higher. I can guarantee you that. But so 22 is not bad, but it illustrates a potential opportunity. So those two issues, as I indicated, can add up to heat island. We can actually predict with relative accuracy the heat island impacts of a community based on those characteristics. That's a mathematical formula that we can calculate. And this chart here shows actual readings of heat island in the Twin City Metro, and Burnsville's outlined there in white. And you can see that during the summer, heat island, we've got sections of the city that could be 4, 5, 6 degrees warmer than the outlying areas. Water stress, just looking quickly at baseline water stress and change in demand. We have some high water stress within the community. Right now, this information is from an international database, so the level of degree of refinement is relatively large. So this is more of a section of our metro area. Yes, sir.
Could you explain a little more about what water stress is?
Sure. So baseline water stress is a calculation that they produce that includes a wide range of factors. So it's water draw versus water supply. It's the potential for risk to the water supply, whether there's industry or farms that might put pollutants into the water upstream. So it's a combination of all those sorts of things. So currently, we have a high baseline stress, and the change in water demand, though, for the future is sort of moderate. So this does not necessarily paint a particular issue for water demand for Burnsville. However, I think, everything goes downhill. And so whatever we can do to conserve water is always a good thing, both for energy consumption, for city operations, as well as, treating southern Minnesota with some kindness there too. And then, of course, water stress also includes flooding. This map is just relates to FEMA flooding zones, which typically do not include flash flood areas. They're more looking at water bounce. So water bodies that might increase with higher precipitation. But within Burnsville, of course, we do have some areas prone to flooding or possible flooding. Any questions on those indicators, as we call them? So the next section talks about resilience indicators. So these are looking just quickly at sort of overall community health indicators and existing community pollution indicators. These are driven very largely through EPA records and state MPCA records. So like climate impact multipliers, a community's overall resilience can have a multiplying or a mitigating effect. So if a community is already highly resilient, if we have an event, that community is going to be able to respond more rapidly, bounce back, so to speak. If a community is less resilient, then they're more susceptible. So some of the climate impact multipliers are economic stress. This chart just represents wage distribution. The gray bar is 2015. The red bar is 2016 for city of Burnsville. And looking at the Gini wage index, which is a representation of equity, Burnsville is slightly lower than the US average, which means that wages are distributed somewhat more evenly than the US average. But inequality did grow between 14 and 15, which means that populations living under economic stress might be on the growth, might be growing. So it's just an indicator to be aware of. There are health indicators such as poor or fair health, uninsured, asthma, emergency department visits per capita, pulmonary disease hospitalizations per capita, heart attack hospitalizations per capita. And in each of those zones, and now we're switching to county numbers because it's not granular to the city scale. But in each of those zones, as a county, we're a little bit ahead of the state. That isn't saying that those aren't the issues, but it just provides us a place to review ourselves. Heavy traffic and proximity to traffic is a impact multiplier. Burnsville within the metro area probably fares better than many locations, but we do have some sections where traffic impacts are something to be aware of. And this chart is from the EPA. It identifies a number of environmental considerations. And the sections circled in orange are areas where Burnsville is above the state average. So particulate matter, diesel, particulate, respiratory hazard index, and those relate very closely. Traffic proximity and volume, and again, those relate very closely. Hazardous waste proximity. So again, just this is background information at this point, but these are areas to be aware of. And then lastly, housing burden. Housing burden is defined as residents whose a large portion of their economic income is going to pay for housing, enough such that their economic vitality is potentially at risk. And in the city of Burnsville, we've got 46% of the renter households qualify as experiencing housing burden, and 21% of those who own qualifying as living under housing burden, for an average of 30% of residents, households qualifying as living under housing burden. And why this is an issue is, of course, if you're able to make ends meet, but you don't have a lot left over, you might have a hard time updating your house for insulation or flood protection or these other things. Or if you have a health issue, it might be difficult to address because of housing burden, right? So any questions based on those background?
The Superfund item, would that have to do with the landfill?
Unfortunately, I don't know the detail of how EPA calculated that, but a landfill would certainly qualify, as well as other industrial sites that are designated as Superfund sites.
So I'm noticing that this information's from 2015, so that's a couple of years old. Is that pretty typical for this type of information, for there to be quite a lag in terms of report outcomes?
Yeah, unfortunately there is. It's, it takes usually a year for state level to be collecting it. They submit it to EPA, it takes them a year to
Sure.
sort of process it, and then they put it out in the report.
Okay,
And some of this was mined now almost a year ago for this report, so.
sure, thank you.
Okay, so vulnerable populations. And there are a number of vulnerable populations, and we'll kind of go through one by one. We've mapped each one of them, and the purpose for mapping them is to just simply provide an opportunity for the community to understand first what is the order of magnitude for various vulnerable populations in the community, to understand how one vulnerable population might compare against another, and to understand the regions in the city that those vulnerable populations are more concentrated in. And the point of all that is, at the end of this report, we have a number, some probably 120 potential strategies that the city could look at. And some of those strategies you might prioritize and decide that you're going to do 10 strategies and you're going to focus on population A, B, and C. So we're trying to provide background to help in future decision making, so that you can decide where you might put your energies or communications in the community. So the first population of vulnerable population is children under 5. The total population in the city of Burnsville is just under 4,000. And that represents roughly 10%, 1 out of 10 of the total vulnerable population in Burnsville, and about 6% of the city population. And I should also point out, down at the bottom, within the report, we've identified each of the vulnerabilities that each of these groups is particularly sensitive to. The vulnerabilities that I went through before, the extreme weather, air quality, vector-borne diseases, waterborne diseases, et cetera. So each population, we've identified the risks that they're more susceptible to. Okay. So the second group is older adults, and that's defined typically as 65 and older. The total estimated population is a little over 8,000, and it makes up roughly 1/5 of the total vulnerable population in the city of Burnsville, and a little over 13% of the city. The third group is individuals with disabilities. In Burnsville, we've got about 5,200, and they make up about 13 to 15% of the total vulnerable population in the city, or about 8.5% of the total population. The next group is living under economic stress. So in this chart, we've identified 200% poverty, 2 times poverty, and that's the common definition of low income. So that's why we've picked that percentage. It's a very common percentage to pick for these sorts of assessments. And on the left, we have 1-person households, and on the right, we have family of 4 households. The total estimated population is about 8,500. It makes up over 1/5 of the total vulnerable population and about 14% of the total city population. Next group is people of color. Total estimated population is 15,000, making up roughly 37 to 40% of the total vulnerable population, or roughly 25% of the total city population. We've also charted, on this same page, you'll see limited English speakers. That number does not feed into that people of color total, only because the census data we have, we can't tell if that limited English, we can't tell what ethnicity or race that limited English person is. But we've identified it, and also in the report, we identify what those most common languages are. Because as you consider any kind of communications, of course, you can identify your top 5 languages and then translate specific communications that you want to make sure those folks can understand. Next group is at-risk employment. So these are folks that are in climate vulnerable jobs. So think police officers, firefighters, construction workers, maintenance workers, etc. So we have about 5,600 in the city. It's a total of about 10% of the vulnerable population. When we compare it against the total city employment, it's about 17%, and just under 10%, or just over 9% for the total city population. Next categories are food access and vehicle access, and in those numbers we do not have population counts. But we have sections of the city which indicate, for food access, it's tracts which have at least 100 individuals living more than a mile away from a grocery store who do not have access to vehicles. And then the yellow is just simply tracts that have over 100 individuals that do not have vehicles regardless of their economic status. And so at the end of the vulnerable populations, we've compiled then a composite where we try to identify those tracts within Burnsville which have heavier weighted or lighter weighted total vulnerable populations. And again, it's an attempt simply to help provide a framework for discussion or prioritization should the city need to prioritize goals and efforts. And based on the vulnerabilities for the individual population groups, we can identify the top risks for the community. The top risks are extreme weather and temperature and air quality. The second rung of risk is flood vulnerability, most particular flash flood vulnerability, I would say, and vector-borne diseases. And then lesser risks would be food insecurity, waterborne, and at the bottom, water stress, which is, we don't anticipate a significant vulnerability for the city there. So looking at those vulnerable populations, we compare them against the state of Minnesota, the Dakota County, and we can see within that the three, looking at it through that filter, the 3 populations which are larger than either the state or Dakota County are those at those under economic stress, particularly those at 100% poverty, those without vehicle access, and those with limited English. Burnsville is higher than both Dakota County and the state average in each of those. It's just a way of looking at it. I'm not necessarily saying those are the most crucial, but it's a way to review it. So any questions on the vulnerable populations at all?
Yeah, I have a question. So vehicle access becomes an indicator for this study. So how does mass transit continue to figure into that, if we continue to make strides to have access to mass transit, we would expect that a certain percentage of our population within Burnsville wouldn't have access to a car because they're utilizing that resource. Is that figured into this particular study?
Yeah, so those numbers, I should point out also, those numbers I drew from another source.
Yep.
So I can't tell you exactly how they calculated it, other than their overview, which was provided to me. And my understanding is the way they calculate it, they take into account major transit lines, and then distance, how many of those transit lines are within a given tract that have those populations. And so then they're making some assumptions because they're not locating each individual, of course.
Sure.
But those are factored together in my understanding.
Okay, that's helpful. The other thing I noticed is there's some reference to Washington County throughout the materials. Is that like a kind of like a point of reference?
It's
or?
a typo. I'm
Okay.
sorry. And the content is, I know, accurate. Washington County should have just been changed to Dakota County, so I'm
Okay.
sorry for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so looking at the findings, we take those vulnerable population data and we try to slice it a couple different ways to see what it mean. So the first was, as I just went through, comparing it against the county and the state, and the sections which are more heavily weighted in Burnsville versus those districts are lower income families and individuals, individuals with limited English, and individuals without vehicle access. Another way of looking at those numbers is just comparing them against themselves within the city. So we've identified each of those components, their estimated total, and their percentage share of the total vulnerable population counts, which then help us identify that through that lens, people of color, those living in economic stress, and older adults represent the most significant populations within the city. Another way of looking at it is looking at each of the tracts within the city. And just summarizing that here, we have the vulnerable population, the total estimated vulnerable population for each tract, the percentage of the total vulnerable population, and what we've created here is a vulnerability coefficient, which is simply the total number of vulnerabilities divided by the total population within that tract. And so why do we do that? The Census Bureau does not give us information if an individual is an older person living under economic stress and a person of color, for instance. So somebody could show up multiple times. So what we're trying to do is discount that by just simply identifying the coefficient of vulnerability, which means that we still have more instances of vulnerability within one section of the community than another, whether it's more people having multiple or many people having just one vulnerability. So through that, we can identify that the top three tracts that are the ones with the highest percentage of vulnerability, all over 10%. And then comparing the total risk sensitivities. As I say, as we went through each vulnerable population, each population has their unique sensitivities, and then weighting those based on the size of that vulnerability, we can identify those vulnerabilities which are potentially a higher significant issue than a lower potential risk. So the highest potential risks are likely extreme temperature, weather events, air quality impacts, flood, and then lesser so food insecurity and vector-borne diseases. So based on those reviews, the strategies that we've identified and are in the report, as I say, we've got many pages of potential strategies. The strategies which the city may find most useful are strategies to be able to prioritize those which address the risks of extreme temperature and weather, air quality impacts, flood risks, and food insecurity, with a particular attention to strategies that are effective for people of color, especially those with limited English, those in economic stress, and older adults. And geographically, if the city needed to prioritize geographically, we would recommend the census tracts listed there below. I'm sorry, I wish they had nice names, but they just have numbers from the Census Bureau. Those census tracts, this map here shows the, a combination. I indicated as a representation of both tree canopy as well as sun exposure, in other words, obstructions. This actually is a solar insolation map, but if a rooftop has a lot of sun, it means there's not a lot of trees around it. So I use it for both. So the darker sections are those tracts which we would recommend prioritization. And this is just a way of looking at those tracts, and any area that you see that is yellow or orange means that we have a lot of sun exposure, and consequently we may also have lower tree canopy. So one of the recommendations we have detailed in the report is to do a detailed tree canopy assessment and a master plan related to that. And those sections might benefit from that, for instance. Flooding, we can see some of the flooding occurrences that exist in those tracts of higher sensitivity, and there is some. Of course, the major flooding zone, of course, is along the river. So any questions on all of that?
So I guess I have a question about the tree canopy. So this area is primarily not like a dense forest type area. We've learned that over the years from Caleb, I believe. And so how does that, I mean, so should we be planting more of our native planting? I mean, this seems to allude to the fact that we should be getting away from that because of the fact that our area or our peers are shifting south. So potentially native plants that are native in this area, which we've been making a big push for, are no longer going to be native. And this area is potentially not going to be in the same situation that it was, which we're trying to restore it to. So can you talk a little bit about how you balance restoring this to a native place in terms of what we were expecting 50 years ago, and how you balance that with balancing what you're putting into this report here? Because they seem to be conflicting a little bit.
They do conflict. And tree canopy also has a potential conflict with renewable energy, right? However, I can tell you the renewable energy, which I threw out there, there is definitely strategies for balancing those. So don't ever be afraid of that. We can do both. The question you bring up is a brilliant question, and I will tell you that foresters are split almost down the middle on that, and it's being debated kind of hotly right now. There are a number of foresters that say, look, this stuff's changing, and it's going to change. We know it's going to change. We're seeing it already. The centroid of maple trees in Minnesota is moving northward. So the trees that succeed here right now may not all succeed here in 20 years. So that group of folks say, so just get with the program, start planting climate adaptive species. Experiment a little bit, try some trees that are a true zone 4, and see if you can get them to survive so that you're future-proofing that stock. There's another group of foresters that say, well, overall I don't disagree with you except for suburban areas are one of the best areas for maintaining tree stock because people have them in their front yard, we have them at City Hall, we have them at park spaces. These are areas that are curated, and if I see a tree that's starving for water, I'll go get my hose and water it. So that group says, you know, we should consider whether or not we can turn suburban areas into a preserve, to preserve those trees and, more importantly, the ecosystems that are built around those trees. So I can't tell you, I mean, I think, frankly, there's excellent arguments on both sides. And so as an overall strategy related to tree canopy, I would anticipate my recommendation would end up moving towards a both and, where the city should definitely generate climate adaptive tree species so that as a part of the city's planting program or information that you provide to residents, that you're anticipating those changes. But on the other hand, there's also perhaps opportunities to look at preservation and how might we identify species that are at risk in Burnsville, and what can we do to help those weather the future.
And maybe my question was just a little bit different. So I'll use Terrace Oaks as an example, which is a large park within our area. So about a year ago, we embarked on restoring that back to the native oak savanna, I think if I'm remembering the name of that correctly, Hopefully Caleb's proud that I remember that. But that oak savanna was essentially taking down some of the tree canopy to allow some of that savanna type grasses and that kind of experience come through, which directly kind of conflicts with what we have here in terms of wanting more tree canopy. So what I'm hearing you say, and maybe I'm understanding it correctly, is there's the opportunity for that, but then also in other areas around more industrialized areas is increasing that tree canopy. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm
Okay.
sorry. Yeah, in terms of grasslands versus tree canopy, I mean, there's a similar argument on that, but I would definitely lean on the side that, well, the reason why you want to restore grasslands is that there's a whole ecosystem built on that.
Sure.
And it's gone. So whatever we can do to restore that or preserve it is a good thing. But tree canopy is a particular issue in our built environment, right? So where we have homes and streets and office buildings and industrial buildings, the services provided by the tree canopy is pretty massive. So looking for opportunities to increase that is, I think, a fantastic place to start.
Thank you.
Any other questions on that? I just have one more section, which is the recommendations. There's more in the report, specifically the host of strategies, which is great bedtime reading if you're an insomniac. So we have goals and strategies within those that section that relate to building capacity and preparing and responding to the population risk of climate change impacts, responding to heat stress and extreme weather. We have goals and strategies responding to air quality impacts. We have goals and strategies responding to flood vulnerability and responding to food insecurity and foodborne disease risk. And then finally, we have strategies and goals that we are recommending related to enhancing economic resilience in support of climate resilience. So there's no reason why these things have to be counter to each other. Our conclusions are next steps. We recommend considering incorporating appropriate content and findings and recommendations into the city's comprehensive plan. We recommend identifying resources within the community for execution of strategies and communications. We recommend conducting a blue spot flash flood mapping assessment. We recommend assessing the community's water system for resilience. And that's happening anyways, but we recommend it because we want to keep doing it. Engaging city staff in a detailed review of the data and the findings, and engaging the public in a review of the key concepts and data in the report for feedback, their impressions, their ideas, their recommendations, and developing a climate adaptation implementation plan. That would refine and finalize adaptation goals and strategies. As I said, we've got numbers of pages back there, but not all are necessarily appropriate for the community. It would create a delineation of the individuals responsible for the implementation of those strategies and goals. And it would develop a plan for monitoring or reporting the metrics of measurement of effectiveness of the goals. And it would develop a climate vulnerability communication strategy to communicate the goals and strategies to the public appropriately. So any questions overall or on those recommendations?
Just want to thank you. It was very thorough.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, you bet.
Any final questions? Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for letting me be here. I appreciate it.
So I think our next update is the review of Burnsville sustainability update.
Hi, I'm Sue Bass with, I'm the environmental specialist and sustainability coordinator. So do I have this? Great, thanks. And tonight I'm going to give you a quick update on sustainability 2017 to 2017-2018. And the reason I'm doing this is that in 2009, Burnsville City Council adopted the Sustainability Guide Plan. And they looked at 14 priority areas of sustainability, and they termed those best practice areas. They wanted the Parks and Natural Resources Commission to provide a forum for community input into the Sustainability Guide Plan. So that's why I'm here. And today, this evening, I'm going to be talking about the 2017 greenhouse gas inventory, the organics recycling program we have here, community solar garden energy, the recertification of the Audubon golf course, Burnhamwood, partnership to protect pollinators, Crystal Lake, which is now off the impaired waters list. As you were talking about before, goats for the buckthorn control, energy conservation on city properties, and park recycling. So we'll start off with the 2017 greenhouse gas inventory. Every other year, the city of Burnsville conducts a greenhouse gas inventory for city operations using 2005 as a baseline. And our goals that were developed are in line with the state of Minnesota Next Generation Energy Act of 2007. So those goals require a reduction of 15% by 2015, 30% by 2025, and 80% by 2050. So the city of Burnsville exceeded the 2015 goal, and for 2017, we have reduced, for city operations, we have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 28%, which is very close to the 2025 goal, years ahead of schedule. If you look at the green line that is really strikingly going down, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, that is potable water. So pumping water, we have gotten very, very efficient. And that's one of City of Burnsville's most energy consumptive tasks that we do. And so with variable frequency drive pumps, with pumping from Kramers instead of, deep into the ground, it has all helped us to reduce our energy consumption of pumping water. I don't know if, I was really surprised when I first started doing this that pumping water was our most energy consumptive task that we do. So that's very impressive. And then, but the blue line for buildings and facilities, it doesn't look like we've gone down all that much. But between 2005 and 2017, we have added a large building, a large energy using building called the Ames Center. And we've added parking ramp, and we've added a parking deck. And we're still not going up. So we've really done a good job on that also. And then the organics program. This year we've added, so organics, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has found that about a third of what we're throwing away in the trash could be composted. So we're looking at organics, something that can, that was natural and can be composted. That's what organics are. And a number of our city facilities are now collecting organics, and we're bringing that to a commercial composting center. So this year, the ICE Center started in 2015. The Maintenance Center started back in 2007. And the Ames Center started in January of this year. Police Department and City Hall started in May. So we've got quite a few of our city facilities collecting not only recycling, but also the organics recycling. So And it's not here, but it's in the lunchrooms. We place them mostly in the lunchrooms and by coffee, where coffee is made.
Excuse me, how's the compliance been, with sometimes getting mixed streams with recycling?
So, thank you, Commissioner Cleveland, thank you. That is a great question. And we've looked at that pretty carefully, and there's always more education that's needed. I mean, on the whole, we're doing really well. There's things like coffee cups that they're paper, but they're not compostable coffee cups. And it needs to be, for these commercial composting facilities, it needs to be BPI certified compostable material. And so sometimes a few things that it's just difficult for people, they'll stand and try and figure out which one. But on the whole, we're doing very well. So just a little bit more education and looking at making sure that we purchase, we have had to use up the old coffee cups, and when we purchase new ones, we have to purchase the correct ones. Good question, thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Community solar gardens. The city council authorized contracts for approximately 50% of the city of Burnsville energy use in the XL energy territory. And over a 25-year time period, it is projected that the city will save $2.75 million. So, and in the last 16 months, we've saved about $10,000. Burnham Wood has been recertified as an Audubon cooperative sanctuary, and it's one of only 894 courses in the world to be designated as such. And Burnham Wood has done a number of things, environmental planning, water conservation, water quality management, and wildlife management and habitat to get that certification. Partnership to protect pollinators, XL Energy, and City of Burnsville have worked together to develop pollinator habitat that benefits bees, butterflies, and other insects that pollinate. Nearly 3 acres of native prairie plantings have been put in by XL Energy right-of-way next to Tennessee Park. Crystal Lake is off the impaired waters list. It was on the impaired water list in 2002, and by using different strategies, harvesting curly leaf pondweed, building underground systems to treat stormwater, and directing stormwater into areas that filter out contaminants. So the phosphorus levels have been reduced, and Crystal Lake is now off the impaired waters list. And as you were talking about, goats for buckthorn control, and there will be a pilot project this fall in a 2-acre area at Civic Center Park to see if we can bring in goats for a few weeks. And this would reduce the need for herbicides in savanna restoration projects. And one of the ways that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, that's why we've done such a good job, is that the City of Burnsville Facilities has really worked so hard to replace obsolete, worn-out equipment with the most energy-efficient models. And they have, for LED lights, they've replaced office lights, skate park fixtures, city hall parking lot fixtures, vehicle bay lights, and Ames Center audience seating lights, all into LED. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is park recycling. More than 130 recycling containers were placed in 22 parks this year. Some of the best management practices were that we placed recycling cans and trash cans next to each other, made sure that they were labeled, made sure that the color of the recycling container was blue, trash, gray, or black. And it has worked very well. Oh, yeah, and then the top with a constricted opening for the recycling so that it's not, people have to think before they put the recycling in there. And it has worked really well. I've just been so surprised. It's just a thrill to go to the recycling dumpster, take a look in there, and it is really clean, a clean stream of recycling, very little contaminants in there. And this summer it's been about every 7 to 10 days that we have filled that 20-yard container. And so we have produced this sustainability update that talks about what I've just talked about, and then Ted Redmond's report, a little bit about that. And we have put that in an update, and if you have suggestions, we can change it, but at some point in time, we will put it on the website. Any questions or suggestions?
I think it all looks really great. Are you gonna try and put more recycling bins in parks for the next year also, or?
Well, the recycling bins that we've put out, we've made a very concerted effort to cover the parks, like the athletic complexes, Crystal Beach, the places where we're gonna get the most
Volume?
volume of recycling. But, so we're covering quite a bit on what we do right now, but it does not prohibit that we'll take a look and see if there's other spots that we can place it.
Great.
Any further questions?
Yeah, just kind of curious, the use of goats for buckthorn control, mainly to slow down seed production, is going to be my guess for the purpose.
Mr. Cleveland, you're asking the wrong person.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Caleb would probably be the person to ask about that, and I certainly can get back to you. I have talked to Caleb, but I actually do not know the answer to that particular question, unless JJ does.
Commissioner Cleveland and rest of the commission, next month, when we're on our parks tour, we will have more information on the process. Hopefully Caleb can attend that evening. Hopefully he's the one presenting the information and not just a fact sheet on it, but he will have more information next month on the purpose and the reasoning behind it, so,
Okay, thank you.
yes.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you very much for your presentation. So moving on to the last item of miscellaneous, I do see in the packet here, we received some of the material we asked for at a previous meeting, including the drainage system maps and the stenciling maps.
That is correct, Acting Chair Newman. There's a full list of items here in your miscellaneous packet and a number of maps that, again, you can pour over at any time. But on the miscellaneous category, I just want to point out the first two items. That is, I'd like to welcome our new commissioners, Mark Cleveland, Lily Valverde Ortiz, and Manisha Maturla to our commission. They started on July 1st with us, and without having a meeting in July, this is actually the first meeting we've had for them to attend, so welcome to them. And as I was just saying, next month is our annual Parks Tour. We are still working on the details as to the parks and the projects that we're going to go out and take a look at, but we're hoping that Civic Center and the goat buckthorn removal project is one of them. We're working on an archery range. We're working on pickleball courts at Red Oak Park. And there's some of you that haven't seen the nature play area yet over at Terrace Oaks East. So we've got about 5 sites right now that we'll make a stop at. I'd also like to tell you that we're not just going to do a drive-by. We're not looking at these locations out of the window. So please plan accordingly. We're going to get out. We're going to walk the sites. We're in the weather. We're in the climate. So whatever you need to do to dress appropriate would be
What's
greatly
the date?
appreciated. Monday, September 17th, and same time, 6:30 p.m. I believe from City Hall here.
Any
Thank you.
further miscellaneous items?
That is it. I'll leave the rest for you folks to read at your leisure.
Sounds great. So I think we're ready to adjourn. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you for coming to tonight's version of the Parks and Natural Resources Commission. Have a great night.